It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Kat Swetel. I've heard her speak a few times, and she speaks at a lot of conferences like Lean Agile Scotland, Spark the Change, Agile Alliance, the big Agile Alliance conference, Agile and Beyond, and lots of others. And she's spoken on a variety of topics. She's an amazing speaker and a consultant in the Agile and technology space. And today she's going to be introducing us to Wardley Mapping. So Kat, with no more time taken by me, over to you. And thanks a lot for coming.
Hello, everybody. If you'll give me just 1 minute, I'm going to share my screen. I think that'll be good. Okay, do you see it? Nod, smile, thumbs up. Yep, great, good. Terrific. Okay, yes, I'm Kat. I did just recently change jobs, so now I work at Verica. We do continuous verification, and if you're curious about that, of course, you can ask me whatever questions specifically about that. Moving right along, I do have to give you a little bit of a warning. I didn't pre-record this talk, of course, so at any point, one of the 4 small children that live here could come into my office, and if you ignore them, they eventually go away. So that's what I'm hoping for. Now, let's get to the meat of this, shall we? So I'm just wondering a little bit about the audience. I'll make sure that I can see here. Okay. Who has heard of Wardley Maps? And if you want to just go in the chat and kind of put where you are at with Wardley Maps, that would be rad. Okay. All right. Pretty mixed, but we have a fair number of beginners. Okay, so this talk, I'm explaining to you, I'm doing an intro of Wardley Maps, right? So if you are a more advanced practitioner, then you know, you probably won't be fascinated by the intro stuff, but I have included a lot of hot takes that probably only someone who's done multiple maps would pick up on. So you may or may not want to stick around for 15 minutes and see some of that. Anyway, let's jump in. So when you are creating a map, because I said I would teach you how to read and create a map. So first thing you gotta have when you are going to create a Wardley map, because you wanna seem smart or cool or whatever the case may be, you need a value chain. So you're going to need to map a value chain. So I have done that for you all. I decided to create a value chain of something that I find interesting, which is the Klingon tea ceremony. So we have our friend Worf, and he wants to do the Klingon tea ceremony. So he's going to need a cup of tea. In order to make a cup of tea, you're going to need hot water and this Klingon, so you're going to need some poisonous flowers. How do you get that hot water when you're in the middle of space and it's very cold? You need a replicator, okay? So these are the things that go into a cup of tea, which you will need for the tea ceremony. You're also going to need a friend. Maybe she's a doctor. You're also going to need some poetry that you share with each other over your poisonous cup of tea. If you're going to continue to have a friend after she drinks the tea, then you're going to need an antidote, because no human could survive that. And in order to get the antidote, at this point, you need a doctor, because it's kind of like an artisanally mixed thing. So that's a value chain for the Klingon tea ceremony. Is that a map? Is that a Wardley map? Now, what's the difference? You have a value chain. What the heck makes it a Wardley map? Okay, so maps are different. Maps have an anchor, they have position, and they have movement. So basically, where things are on a map matters. If I move things around on the page, that matters to the meaning of the map. And we expect there to be movement in the map, or whatever, some option for movement. So movement is part of the map. Okay, so we're going to map this Klingon tea ceremony. First, we have to understand that anchor, which is the user need. So what does Worf say that he needs? He says that he needs to have tea. But really what's going on here? Well, he wants to show appreciation for his friend who's a human. And so she wouldn't have this opportunity normally. This like a special thing that he can share that's like part of his culture. So now we have an anchor. The position of the things on the map is going to be meaningful because it's in the context of this anchor. Okay, so do we have position? Do we have movement? Well, folks, let's carry on. So the x-axis, the horizontal axis for a Wardley map is evolution. So evolution of the components that are displayed on that map. And I don't know whether that makes a lot of sense. So we'll use these categories to talk about evolution. So all the way on the left, the least evolved, that would be Genesis. These are the things that you see and you're like, what the heck is that? I don't even know how to interact with that, right? Completely unknown and novel. Custom is what it sounds like. That's like a custom thing for someone. Product, you buy that off the shelf and, you know, whatever. Commodity, these are the things that you only notice when they're broken. So all of us, it's a pandemic, woohoo. So what do we become aware of our electricity every day? Do we like walk into our office or wherever you sit down for work? Wow, what a good electricity day. I'm really enjoying the electricity today. You probably don't do that, right? You probably only take notice of electricity when it's not working the way that it should. So those things would be more commodity, where they only become conspicuous when they're broken. So that's kind of how things evolve. They proceed through those stages, the components proceed through those stages, that's evolution. Let me look at the chat. Okay. So far, she's a lot talking about Klingons, but are there any questions on this evolution part, like before I proceed? Some people are doing like the tilt your head thing, so I'm not totally sure. Good? Okay. All right. So now we take those things that Worf is going to need in order to participate in the Klingon tea ceremony with his friend, and we map them along that x-axis, which is evolution. And so I kind of just did that. Put all of the components into these little categories. How the heck did I do that? Is it because I'm just so dang good? No. There's this handy dandy little sheet to get you started if you need this. So Simon Wardley, I should explain, is a very strange man, and he has all of these strange ideas about intellectual property, and he thinks that the best way that you can treat things like Wardley mapping is giving them away for free. So if you want to go, you can go look up Simon Wardley on Medium, and all of this stuff is for free. And then there's a bunch of other things in the ecosystem, and no one's like putting any of that stuff behind a paywall. So there's this handy dandy sheet. The one thing, you know, you can, I mean, I'll show you. You can just literally go through and highlight things or circle things or whatever the case may be, and nothing is gonna be like all in one of these columns, right? You're gonna have things that whatever go across multiple columns, and you just kind of pick where you think it should be. Anyway, the thing that I will call your attention to is up at the top. That's why I'm waving my arm around. Anyway, you can have components that are all different sorts of things, right? So there's like, there could be activities, there could be data, there could be practices, like individual practices, there could be just knowledge that people have to know or that a system has to contain. You can adapt these categories for all of those things. So there's some different words to use for each of those. I'm going to use the ones for activity because I think it just makes the most sense for explaining the Klingon tea ceremony, which is, my friends, an activity. Okay. All right. So you can look this up. The link is at the bottom of every slide, so, and I can also paste it in the chat. Now you have all these things categorized. What is the y-axis? Well, it's sort of visibility. So Simon Wardley says visibility might be a good thing to start out with on the y-axis, but you may or may not continue to use that. Personally, I like some of the things from service design and like service blueprints. And so I found that keeping visibility and that there's multiple lines like front stage, backstage within one value chain, that's been quite helpful for me, right? So you wouldn't expect like someone working the register to sell someone something to have visibility all the way back into those things. And you would expect like a developer who's working on whatever the point of sale system is to have some visibility both above and below them and of course to the side. Anyway, so the y-axis, generally visibility, maybe. Okay. Okay, perfect. So does anyone have any observations about this? Any at all? I have this map. If you had this map and you're wanting to share this moment with your friend and then an idea strikes you and you're like, I bet there's a bunch of Klingons out there that want to share this special moment with a human friend. What could I do to facilitate that? What might you do here? What stands out to you about this map, if anything? You can answer in the chat or like Morse code me something with your blinking or yes, poison flowers. That seems weird, right? That a cup of tea is just a cup of tea, right? Tea is not all that different, one tea from another. We know what a cup of tea is. We know everyone knows how to make a cup of tea, and you might like quibble with people in different areas. But then poison flowers, not very well understood by a large portion of the market. And you have to do all this weird stuff to go get them. You have to like go to the planet or something, right? So what you might want to do is say, how do we get the recipe for those poison flowers into this replicator so that we can treat the poison flowers as a commodity? But you could, how do I determine where something falls along the visibility? That's a good question. It's not, I guess I wouldn't get that hung up on it, but what I think is helpful is to put in lines of sight. Like the people having the tea, actually having the tea in this scenario, you might do like a line of sight there because above doctor and replicator, because they may or may not see the doctor and the replicator. They may only just see the antidote that needs to be administered so they don't die while they're having a cup of tea. But in order to say where something falls along visibility, which again, I don't think you should get hung up on it at all, but you should ask both who can see this and who cannot see this, right? And that will help you decide there. But again, do not get caught up on visibility unless it's quite important for your use case. So if you're doing something with service blueprints or service design or things like that. So yes, moving poison flowers would be another interesting thing to do. You can add a lot of things on here, like I could introduce the flows of capital, which of these components or which interactions of components take the most capital. Other things that I have done before are like, in order for us to provide this value, this activity needs to happen multiple times. And so like make the lines fatter or like draw circles around it, right? But you should feel free to embellish it in a way that is useful for you. The other thing that I would say before I go into one last distinction before my time is over is that a hideous map is a good map, because what you're really trying to facilitate is conversation, right? So something that looks unfinished will invite people to finish it. So that's the one last thing I would say. So now you know how to read a map and you have a beginning understanding of how to draw a map. Now I'm going to tell you why that's completely unimportant, and I'm sorry about that. So Wardley Map is a thing. It's an actual artifact that we use to think about the evolution of socio-technical systems. However, Wardley Mapping is a whole set of tools. So we talk about doctrine, and we talk about pioneer, settler, town planner, and these different ways for thinking about people and the aptitudes that they have. And so all of those tools together, that is Wardley Mapping. And even if you're not in a position where you can create a lot of maps, I would argue that by adopting some of the terminology and having that as sort of a shared lexicon and a baseline for talking about the evolution of socio-technical systems, you will see a huge benefit just from doing that, even if no one is drawing a map. So there's a very big difference between Wardley Mapping, the activity that is Wardley Mapping, and the actual artifact that is the Wardley map. And I think if you're able to adopt some of the things in Wardley Mapping, you're still going to see a lot of benefit, even if Wardley Maps are not ubiquitous wherever you work. Yes, so that's this. Yeah. So what I like to say is that mapping is an activity best shared, like your cup of tea there. So I highly encourage you to take like a social approach to this and use these as tools to open a conversation or to further a conversation or get to a decision. Map Camp is coming up, and I think it's like free this year, so that seems cool. Simon pulls together a bunch of people with the idea that maybe they'll argue with one another, and that seems probable this year. And then if you want some tools for getting started with actual mapping, this is the place that I recommend you start. Learnmorelynapping.com. And I believe that's it. So thanks.
That was awesome, Kat. What a really fire hose introduction to the elements that go into Wardley Mapping. A couple of questions have come through the chat privately to me, so I'm just going to start going through some of them, and I've got to go with this first one here because so first of all, Jeffrey asked the question, will we get a copy of the presentation? There is a link to the YouTube channel where you can go back and watch this. I'd also encourage you to go to Simon's resources that are online, and you can get all of that information. Is that probably the best, Kat? Is there anything else that you want to share?
No, I think the medium.com/Wardley Maps or learnwardleymapping.com, it's all the same stuff, just slightly lower on the snark.
Okay. Cool. The first question that I really wanted to get to was one here that you talked about getting the flowers in space and how difficult it is to do that, about needing to go to the planet. I'm wondering if that would be different if it was Worf on the Enterprise versus Worf on DS9, where, he could go to one of the shops and get stuff. And then, what might happen if the tea was being made at Quarks, for example.
Oh my God, that's exactly this morning. I said to my son, I'm like, what if someone talks about counterfeit flowers at Quarks? Because we're big DS9 fans. So for those of you who don't know anything that we're saying, and you're happy that we're not friends with us, so Deep Space Nine is a station rather than a ship. So it gets like a bunch of traders and stuff like that through there. So you may have access to a wide variety of artisanal goods. Or maybe they're not so artisanal and they're either counterfeit or, it's supposed to be the real thing, but it's actually replicated or whatever. And if you wanted that kind of thing, you'd be going to Quarks, and he's the guy who would sell it to you. Yeah.
So
that brings up a really interesting point, right? Like in situations like that, there really isn't a distinction besides how the person feels about it, right? And so that's a question that I really like to ask as I am going through a map, either alone or with other people. Am I putting this in this category because it belongs here? Or is it just because I am a turd and I'm treating it in a really weird way, right? Like some of you may or may not know that I really like old, weird things or extremely new weird things. Basically, if it's really broken, I will probably like it. And so I have managed platforms that were written, I guess over 10 years before I was born. And that's a thing, right? In that space, on like a legacy space or enterprise space, how am I treating this component versus how is the rest of the industry treating this component? So I work a lot in highly regulated industries. You, in a highly regulated industry, you treat compute not as a commodity, right? And that's like a thing that you manage and you have to think about it. You don't just only notice it when it's not there. But if you're working probably in some other industry or even a different area in the same organization, you could be treating compute as basically a commodity because it's just AWS or Azure or whatever the case may be, right? So I'd like to ask that question. I managed to make this serious somehow. How am I treating this component versus how is the rest of the industry treating this component?
It sounds like going through the activity of Wardley mapping is a fantastic technique, not about getting to the outcome or the output, which you kind of alluded to, but about facilitating a great conversation to get people on a shared understanding of where things are in our specific domain, which is kind of like the joke I made about DS9 versus the enterprise. But it sounds like it's a great way to get people all on the same page. Has that been your experience?
Yes and no. So there are some of my favorite Canadians on this call, and they can probably tell you that I do not shy away from conflict. But I guess what I like about Wardley Maps is it levels the playing field. So if people are going to disagree, we actually know that people are going to disagree and why. And if people are going to agree, we can feel fairly confident that we all understand enough where we're actually either bought into the decision or going to go along, but you kind of give up your ability to say later, like, oh, I didn't understand which components were involved. And, you know, I didn't understand that this was going to be some ridiculous pricing scheme that we might see in customer product versus the pricing schemes, which is like pay per use that we see in commodity or something like that, right? So I like Wardley Maps because they open those conversations to anyone rather than like only people in blue suits who went to a fancy MBA program or whatever the case may be, but inviting just all of the people that have something to add there.
Cool. I got a couple of follow-up questions, but Mike Kaufman's put his hand up. So why don't we, Mike, if you want to unmute yourself. And see if you can answer ask your question.
Thanks, I appreciate that. So I really like kind of what we're coming around, that the mapping is what's really interesting, and the same thing is being said in the chat. My question though is that if I were to take a look at user story mapping, right, it's not about the map, it's about the conversations you have in the creation of the map, but those conversations are around something. And in user story mapping, the conversations are around the product or how a customer might use a product. In impact mapping, the conversation is not it's not about the impact map, it's about the conversations, but the conversations are about how does a particular feature might impact a business metric, right? In Wardley mapping, I get that it's about the conversations, but what I'm missing is what are the conversations about? I haven't gotten that yet.
Oh boy, this is a question, isn't it? Okay. So I guess, have you ever seen Simon Wardley's like intro to Wardley mapping?
No, sorry,
yes,
I'm a complete neophyte.
Okay, so he talks about being a CEO and just having no idea what he was doing at all. So I think that's the substance of the conversation, which is probably a really unsatisfying answer. But what we're thinking about is the evolution of socio-technical ecosystems. But why you are seeking to evolve that, or what part of that ecosystem you're looking to evolve, is totally contextual. Does that make any sense at all, even a teensy bit?
I guess a little bit. I could generalize that to say it's a conversation about the system.
Yes.
Fair enough.
Yep.
Good. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess, like, you know, what is an OODA loop about? You know, that's kind of an odd question, right? And like, what is PDCA about? You know, I think these are tools for orienting yourself and not really anything more than that.
Just maybe you could expand on that just a little, Kat. We're going to go to David. David's put his hand up as well, as my neighbor decides it's now time to mow the lawn. But Dave, we'll come to you in a second. Before we do, two quick things, Kat. You just mentioned the OODA Loop and PDCA. Wondering if you can just sort of unpack what those acronyms mean, just in case folks aren't familiar. And before you do that, in the chat window is about to be pasted a feedback link. If you do have to drop off because it is 6:30, love it if you could take a couple of seconds just to provide some feedback to the organizers of AgileTO. And with that, Kat, maybe you can explain what OODA and PDCA are.
Yes, so those are basically just like ways for perceiving your situation to help you get to a better situation. OODA is observe, orient, decide, act. And PDCA is plan, do, check, act. But basically it's checking, right? Because each one of us, because our brains can only process so much, right? You first might want to make sure that you're perceiving the right things, right? And whatever, figure out what the right thing to do is in context and try that out and give feedback.
Awesome. And Paul Carvello added into the feedback that PDCA can also be PDSA, where the S is study instead of check. All right, David, Sabine, you had your hand up, sir. What question do you have?
Well, first, thank you, Kat, for being here. It would have been really nice to meet you in person. I follow you on Twitter, and so it's nice to meet you. My question, I'd love to hear you elaborate further on the issue of movement. I forget, what were the three words on an earlier slide? Movement was the third.
Yeah, you need to have an anchor because otherwise everything is meaningless. You have to have position and then you have to have movement.
So I don't have a specific question about movement, but I'd like to just hear more about how you think through that.
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, honestly, I feel like I'm the wrong person to give these introductions, but also maybe I'm the right person because I don't have like some fancy thing that I'm doing. I'm just like, that looks weird. Why is the whole thing not going this way? Why is there like a random arm that's like headed in its own direction? That seems weird. Should that be moving somewhere? This has a smell to me, right? But I guess just same as those other things, first you're trying to orient yourself to where I am, and then you can say, okay, where should I be going from here? But a lot of times, just because we're heads down in our work or whatever the case may be, right, we may not be totally oriented to our situation, and so we may not be choosing to move anywhere. We may just be moving, right? Or even worse, stagnating and dying.
Kat, it makes me think a little bit about doing Kano analysis for those who are familiar with it, and the idea that at some point, delighters, the things that people love, eventually become the table stakes. You know, and I think of airbags in cars just as an example. You know, once upon a time, airbags were on every commercial that was on TV. And over time, no one even talks about airbags anymore. They've gone from being a delighter, a thing that people would pay extra for on their car, to now just an absolute a commodity, you know, going back to, I think, the word you used. So when you talked about movement anyway, it made me think of that. There's a comment, and I'm going to get the name wrong in the chat, so I apologize. I'm not even going to try. But there's a comment there about, isn't movement the evolution?
Yes. Sorry, I don't know what else. I guess things also like disappear, right? Like sometimes you have a thing and it either fractures into multiple things as it evolves or collapses, which is, I don't know about that. But anyway, yeah, it's just all evolution. Yep.
So I'd love to sort of wrap things up here, Kat, but before we do, just wondering if you could maybe provide those links again, places where if people wanted to go and find out about Wardley Mapping, if they wanted to reach out and find out more about you, or if they wanted to find out more about Map Camp coming up, where we can argue. Are there links that that people can go to? Where's the best place for people to go?
Yes.
Oh, perfect. They're in the chat.
I'm pulling them up. Yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you for the quick introduction tonight. I know that I didn't, we didn't give you, the organizers didn't give you, I'm going to blame the organizers, not me, didn't give you a lot of time to introduce the complicated world of Wardley mapping and an opportunity to dig in, to really get into just how much amazing stuff there is here. But, you know, a really quick introduction as to how we use them, when we might use them, and the elements that make up a map. Really appreciate your time tonight. And joining us you were saying earlier that it's a gray outside because of the smoke from forest fires. Well, it's gray up here in Toronto, but that's just because it's raining or going to rain.
Are you sure I would prefer that?
We would too. But thank you so much for the talk tonight and for the introduction to the topic. Just a reminder, folks, please take a couple of minutes to fill out the feedback form so the organizers can get your feedback as to what topics you'd like to hear. And Kat, thank you again so much for tonight. Really, really appreciate your time and for the intro.
Thank you. Have a good evening.